It was a crisp afternoon when Emily, still in her school uniform, walked home from the bus stop. She loved these walks, the quiet moments between school and home, when the world seemed to slow down. Her sneakers clicked softly on the pavement, and the wind tugged at her hair, sending leaves skittering across the road. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, a sign that fall had truly arrived. As she rounded the corner near the park, something unusual caught her eye. A small crowd had gathered near a park bench, and Emily felt her curiosity tug at her. People often stopped here, some to chat, others to sit and enjoy a break. But this was different. They were standing in a tight cluster, talking in hushed voices, their faces filled with concern. A man who appeared to be in his late 60s was kneeling by the bench, his hands gently cradling something. Emily's gaze shifted to the object in his hands, and her heart skipped a beat. It was a tiny puppy, no older than a few weeks, wrapped loosely in an old towel. Its fur was matted and dirty, its little body limp. Emily's stomach tightened. The puppy wasn't moving, wasn't even breathing hard. It seemed lifeless. The man spoke in low, steady tones, but his words were too soft for Emily to hear. A woman standing near the crowd shook her head as she stepped away from the group. "Poor thing," she murmured. "There's nothing to be done." Emily's heart twisted as she approached the bench. The puppy's fur, once fluffy and soft, looked dull and lifeless, like a doll someone had forgotten about. The man noticed her and gave a small nod, as though inviting her to come closer. Emily hesitated for a moment, then knelt beside him. She couldn't stop looking at the small creature in his hands. Is it okay?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man sighed heavily and looked down at the puppy. "I'm afraid not. Someone left it in a box over by the park gate. Looks like it's been here for hours, maybe more. It's barely breathing." Emily reached out a trembling hand, wanting to touch it but too scared to disturb the stillness. The puppy's tiny chest rose and fell so slowly it seemed like it might stop at any moment. The man rubbed its back gently. "I've called animal services, but they said they can't come for a while. There's not much hope for this one." Emily swallowed hard, her throat tight. She couldn't walk away. Not like this. The puppy was so small, so helpless. She didn't know why, but something inside her refused to let it go. Something told her that if she just held it a little longer, maybe, just maybe, it wouldn't be so alone. She looked up at the man, her voice barely audible. Can I hold it?" The man paused, then nodded, handing the limp puppy to her with a quiet sigh. As Emily cradled the small form in her arms, she felt the weight of responsibility pressing on her chest. The puppy was still, silent. It was as though the world had paused around them. Everything seemed to disappear as Emily whispered to the tiny creature in her arms, "I won't let you be alone. I promise." The air felt colder now, the light fading as the sun dipped lower in the sky. Emily held the puppy gently, cradling its fragile body against her chest. She could feel its tiny heartbeat, faint, almost too soft to notice, but it was there. Her fingers brushed against its damp fur, as if trying to coax life back into it. But it felt so still, so delicate. The crowd around her began to disperse, their whispers growing softer. Some had already given up. They had seen enough, felt the hopelessness in the air, and moved on. But Emily couldn't move. She couldn't let it go. The man who had been holding the puppy turned to walk away, but he paused, glancing back at her. "You should take it to the vet," he said, his voice heavy with doubt. "It might be too late, but you never know." His words hung in the air like a warning, a reminder of how fragile life could be. But Emily didn't care. She had to try. She wasn't ready to accept the quiet finality in his voice. Not yet. Not when the puppy was still in her arms, not when it had such a tiny spark of life left. "Where's the nearest vet?" Emily asked, her voice more certain than she felt. The man pointed toward the main street, his eyes softening just slightly. "A few blocks down. The clinic's open late, so you might get in quicker." He hesitated for a moment, then added, "But it might not matter. You might be wasting your time." Emily ignored the words. She couldn't think about that right now. The only thing that mattered was getting the puppy help, no matter the odds. She looked down at the tiny creature in her arms. Its eyes were closed, its breathing shallow, but there was still warmth. There was still something there. "Thank you," she whispered to the man, before quickly turning to head toward the street. Her heart raced as she started walking faster, her footsteps echoing in the quiet of the evening. She kept her gaze fixed on the puppy, not daring to look away for fear that, if she did, it might slip away. As she walked, her thoughts were a jumbled mess. What if the puppy didn't make it? What if it had already been too long? She had heard the whispers of others, the doubt in their voices, and it was hard to shake the fear that they might be right. But she couldn't just leave it. She couldn't walk away and pretend she hadn't tried. The path to the clinic was blurry in her mind. She barely noticed the cars passing by or the streetlights flickering on one by one. All that mattered was getting to that clinic, getting the puppy into the hands of someone who could help. By the time Emily reached the clinic, the sky had darkened completely. She was out of breath, her hands cold from holding the small body so tightly, but she didn't care. She pushed open the clinic door, her heart pounding. "Please," she said urgently, "I need help." The clinic was quiet, the sound of her footsteps on the tile floor echoing in the dimly lit hallway. Emily stood at the front desk, her breath coming in short gasps, her eyes wide with worry. The woman behind the counter looked up from her computer, her expression unreadable. "What seems to be the problem?" she asked, her tone professional but tinged with concern as she glanced at the puppy cradled in Emily's arms. It's not moving," Emily said, her voice trembling. "I found it in the park, and I don't know what happened. It's so small, and it's barely breathing. Please, you have to help." The receptionist's eyes softened when she saw the state of the puppy, but she didn't hesitate. "We'll take a look at it. Go ahead and sit over there," she said, motioning toward the waiting area. Emily nodded, her legs feeling like they might give out from the tension in her body. She made her way to the small row of chairs, the puppy still nestled against her chest. Her hands were cold, but she kept her grip firm. The puppy's tiny body felt so fragile, like a breath could break it, and the thought made her stomach twist. She sat down, glancing at the clock on the wall. The seconds seemed to stretch into minutes, each one pulling her further into an anxious silence. The clinic was mostly empty, the quiet hum of the fluorescent lights the only sound. Emily didn't even notice the time passing. Her focus was solely on the puppy, its shallow breaths the only reassurance she had that it was still with her. The stillness of the room was overwhelming. Each passing second felt like an eternity. Emily couldn't look away from the puppy's tiny chest, hoping against hope that it would rise and fall more steadily, that it would somehow come back to life. But it didn't. It remained limp in her arms, its breathing slow and shallow. "Emily." Her mother's voice broke through the silence, and Emily looked up. Her mom had arrived, her face pale with worry. She had rushed straight from work when Emily had called, her voice frantic and filled with fear. She rushed over to Emily's side and gently touched her shoulder. "I'm here now," her mom said, trying to offer comfort, but there was an edge of concern in her voice that mirrored Emily's own feelings. "It's not moving, Mom. It's barely breathing," Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. Her eyes welled with tears, and she blinked them away, not wanting to break down in front of her mother, though the weight of fear was too much to bear. Her mom sat beside her, placing a hand on her knee. "You did the right thing, Emily. You got it here. That's all we can do right now." But Emily wasn't sure. Was it enough? Was it too late? The uncertainty gnawed at her, but she held the puppy closer, as if by sheer will she could breathe life back into it. A few moments later, the door to the back of the clinic opened, and a tall vet emerged. His name tag read Dr. Wallace, and his face was kind but serious as he approached. "I'm Dr. Wallace," he said, Let's take a look at this little one." Emily felt a glimmer of hope. Finally, someone who might be able to help. Dr. Wallace led Emily and her mother to a small exam room at the back of the clinic. The walls were lined with shelves of medical supplies, and the air smelled faintly of antiseptic. Emily's heart beat faster with each step, her hand still clutching the puppy tightly, as though holding on would somehow make a difference. The vet gestured for Emily to place the puppy gently on the examination table. She hesitated for a moment, her fingers brushing against its soft fur one last time before she let go. The puppy's body felt unnaturally light as she set it down, a wave of fear rushing over her. Was she doing the right thing? Would it wake up once the vet helped? Or was it already too late? Dr. Wallace didn't waste any time. He reached out, his hands careful and practiced as he gently checked the puppy's vital signs. He placed a stethoscope on its tiny chest, listening intently for a heartbeat. The sound was barely there, faint and irregular, but it was enough. His brows furrowed, and he worked quickly, moving the puppy to a small heating pad and hooking it up to an IV. "How long has it been like this?" Dr. Wallace asked, glancing over at Emily as he continued his work. "About an hour," Emily replied, her voice shaking. "I found it in the park. It was just lying there, not moving. I didn't know what to do." Dr. Wallace nodded as he adjusted the IV drip, his movements smooth and professional. "You did the right thing by bringing it here as soon as you could. It's in shock, most likely from being abandoned in the cold for so long. We're going to get it warmed up and hydrated, and we'll see how it responds." Emily's breath caught in her throat. Shock. That word, so clinical, yet so terrifying. Was it too much for the little puppy? Had it been too long already? Her mom sat beside her, gently squeezing her hand. "It's in good hands now, Emily. Let's just give it time." But time felt like the enemy. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in Emily's ears as she watched Dr. Wallace continue his work. Every few moments, the vet would glance at her, his face calm but serious, as if measuring her reaction. He seemed to be doing his best to keep the situation under control, but Emily could feel the weight of the moment. She wanted to believe in the possibility of hope, but the doubt gnawed at her. Minutes passed in silence, the only sound the faint peeping of a machine in the corner. Emily stared at the tiny puppy, her heart in her throat. She couldn't stop thinking about the way it had felt in her arms, so still, so fragile. Would it survive this? Would it ever open its eyes again? Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Dr. Wallace stepped back, wiping his hands with a cloth. "It's stable for now. The next few hours will be critical. We'll keep monitoring it, but it's too soon to tell whether it will make it." Emily nodded, though she felt the weight of his words like a heavy stone in her chest. It wasn't over. Not yet. She sat down beside the table, her eyes never leaving the small, fragile puppy. She whispered softly, "You can make it. Please, just hang on." The hours dragged on, each minute stretching out like a heavy, unyielding thread. Emily and her mom had been in the clinic for what felt like forever, though in reality, it had only been a few hours. The silence in the room was overwhelming, broken only by the faint beeping of the machine and the occasional rustle of paper from Dr. Wallace as he checked on the puppy's progress. Emily couldn't stop staring at the small, motionless form on the examination table, hoping, praying for some sign of life. The puppy's tiny chest still rose and fell weakly, but it was so slow, so faint, that it was hard to tell if it was truly alive. Every time Emily blinked, she feared she might miss the moment when it stopped breathing altogether. The air felt thick with the unspoken worry that hung between her and her mom, both of them watching and waiting, trapped in a silent limbo. Just as Emily was about to look away, convinced that the puppy was slipping further away, something changed. It was so subtle at first that she almost missed it. The tiniest shift in the puppy's body, a tiny movement of its head. Then suddenly, a faint whimper broke the silence. The sound was so small, so fragile, that Emily thought she might have imagined. Her heart skipped a beat. She leaned forward, her breath caught in her throat. Had it really cried out? And then, just as quickly as it had come, there was another cry. This time, a little louder, a little more distinct. A soft, almost helpless whimper, like the puppy was calling out, asking for help. The sound pierced through the stillness of the room, cutting through the tension like a ray of light. Emily's eyes widened in disbelief. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, as though afraid to disturb the fragile moment. Dr. Wallace, who had been standing by the door, turned and walked swiftly over to the table. He checked the puppy's vitals again, his face softening slightly. "It's a good sign," he said, his tone quiet but filled with a sense of cautious optimism. "It's responding. It might be small, but it's something. It's trying." Tears welled up in Emily's eyes as she watched the tiny creature in front of her. The puppy's eyes were still closed, its body weak and trembling, but it was alive. It was fighting. And that, in itself, was more than she had dared hope for. "Is it going to be okay?" Emily asked, her voice barely a whisper, as though speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile moment. Dr. Wallace hesitated for a second before answering. "It's too soon to say, Emily, but this is a good start. We just have to keep monitoring it, make sure it stays stable." Emily nodded, the weight of his words settling over her. But even in the midst of uncertainty, she couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. The puppy had cried. It had made a sound, a desperate, small cry that told her it wasn't ready to give up yet. She reached out tentatively, her fingers brushing against the puppy's soft fur. "You're not alone," she whispered softly. "You're going to be okay." For the first time that night, Emily allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the little puppy had a chance. The days that followed were filled with cautious hope. Emily spent every afternoon at the clinic after school, eagerly checking on the puppy, whom they had named Whistle, for signs of improvement. The tiny creature was still fragile, its body weak, but each day brought small changes that lifted Emily's spirits. Dr. Wallace remained cautious in his optimism, reminding her that Whistle was far from out of danger. But the puppy's resilience was undeniable, and Emily couldn't help but feel a growing connection with him. Each day, Whistle seemed to grow just a little stronger. At first, he could barely lift his head, his eyes staying closed for long stretches of time. But slowly, over the course of a few days, his little body began to show signs of life that weren't just limited to the faintest whimpers. His eyes fluttered open for brief moments, and he began to stir in his bed, shifting slightly as if testing the strength of his legs. The once still form was now twitching with tiny movements, like the flicker of a candle's flame. Emily's visits became her anchor. She would sit for hours, talking to Whistle in soothing tones, telling him stories of her day, and singing quietly when the silence grew too thick. Sometimes she would bring small toys with her, a tiny ball or a plush bear, and leave them in his bed, hoping to coax him to play, even if it was just a little. Whistle didn't show much interest at first, but Emily noticed his eyes following the toys, and it gave her hope. One afternoon, as Emily sat beside the small bed in the clinic, she felt a little tug at her heart. Whistle was awake, his eyes open and focused on her face. She couldn't help but smile, the sight of those wide, trusting eyes making her heart swell. She reached out slowly, offering him her hand. To her surprise, he nudged his nose into her palm, a quiet sound of contentment escaping his throat. "He's making progress," Dr. Wallace said as he walked into the room, a pleased expression on his face. "It's slow, but it's steady. His body is gaining strength, and his energy is increasing. I think the worst is behind him." Emily's breath caught in her chest. She couldn't believe it. It was like a dream she had almost stopped believing in. But there it was. Whistle was getting better. He was going to survive. Over the next week, Whistle's progress continued. He began to eat on his own, though it was still just small amounts of food at a time. His strength grew, and with each passing day, he looked less like a fragile creature and more like a playful, curious puppy. Emily began to take him for short walks around the clinic, holding him carefully in her arms and letting him feel the world outside. Each step felt like a small victory. Every new sound Whistle made, a small bark, a wag of his tail, was a reminder of how far he had come. Emily could hardly believe that the tiny, lifeless puppy she had found in the park was the same one now chasing after leaves, his playful nature slowly starting to shine through. Despite all the progress, Emily knew that Whistle's recovery wasn't over. There would be ups and downs, setbacks and challenges ahead. But with each passing day, she was more certain of one thing. She wasn't going to let go. Whistle had already fought for his life, and now she was going to fight alongside him, every step of the way. As the weeks passed, Emily's connection with Whistle deepened in ways she hadn't expected. The once fragile puppy had transformed into a lively little dog, full of energy and curiosity. His coat, once dull and matted, was now soft and shiny, and his eyes sparkled with mischief. He had even gained enough strength to play in the small backyard area of the clinic, running after sticks and wagging his tail in excitement. It was a far cry from the limp, lifeless form Emily had cradled in her arms that first day. Each day, Emily arrived at the clinic, eager to see how Whistle was doing. She brought new toys for him to explore, often finding him in the middle of a game of tug-of-war with the nurses or chasing after a ball across the room. He had a particular fondness for the squeaky toys Emily had brought, often gnawing on them with great enthusiasm, as if he were trying to show the world just how strong he was becoming. Emily couldn't help but smile every time she saw him, her heart swelling with pride. It had been a long, uncertain road to this point, but it had all been worth it. She had seen Whistle through the darkest moments, and now he was thriving. But there were still moments of uncertainty. Whistle's recovery was far from perfect, and Dr. Wallace continued to monitor him closely. There were still occasional setbacks, moments when his energy would dip, and he would need more rest than usual. Emily had learned not to take these moments too seriously, reminding herself that healing wasn't always linear. For every setback, there was always a new milestone to celebrate. One afternoon, as Emily sat on the floor with Whistle, who was happily chewing on a new rubber bone, Dr. Wallace came into the room with a clipboard in hand. He had a smile on his face, but there was a certain seriousness in his eyes. "Emily," he said, walking over to her, "we've been keeping a close eye on Whistle's progress, and I think it's time we talked about his future." Emily's heart skipped a beat. For a moment, she wondered if there was something wrong, if there was some new complication that they hadn't noticed. But Dr. Wallace's expression softened as he continued. "He's doing so well," he said, glancing at the playful puppy in front of him. "His health is improving every day. In fact, I think it might be time for him to go home." Emily's stomach fluttered with a mix of excitement and nervousness. Home. The thought of bringing Whistle home felt surreal. It had been so long since she'd first found him. And now he was ready to leave the clinic and begin a new chapter in his life. A chapter with her. "I can take him home?" Emily asked, her voice a little shaky with emotion. Dr. Wallace nodded, his smile widening. "Yes, but we'll need to monitor him for a little while longer. He'll still need a bit of care and attention, but at this point, he's ready to leave the clinic and settle into a more normal routine." Emily couldn't believe what she was hearing. It felt like a dream come true. She had feared the worst for so long, wondering if Whistle would even make it through the first night. And now, here he was, healthy and full of life, ready to start a new chapter with her. As Emily gently picked up Whistle, feeling the familiar weight of his little body in her arms, she whispered softly to him, "We made it, little one. We really made it." Whistle licked her cheek, as if understanding, and she laughed through her happy tears. The road ahead wasn't guaranteed, but in that moment, Emily knew that she had given Whistle the best chance at life, and he had done the same for her. Together, They would face whatever came next as a team. And that, she realized, was all that mattered. The day Whistle finally went home was one Emily would never forget. It was early in the morning, the sky a pale blue, and the air crisp with the promise of a new season. Emily stood outside the clinic, cradling Whistle in her arms, watching the world around her as if seeing it for the first time. The sun seemed brighter, the trees greener, and the road smoother, as if the entire world was celebrating Whistle's recovery with her. Dr. Wallace had given her a list of instructions, guidelines for taking care of Whistle during his continued recovery. He was still a little weak, and they needed to be careful with his activity for the next few weeks, but the hardest part was over. Emily had worked so hard to get to this moment, and now she was ready for whatever came next. Her mother was waiting in the car, a warm smile on her face as she saw them walking toward the driveway. Emily's heart swelled with gratitude. They had come so far, and now they were heading home together. "You ready?" her mom asked as Emily slid into the car with Whistle still nestled against her chest. "As ready as I'll ever be," Emily replied, her voice thick with emotion. She felt a sense of calm settle over her, a peace she hadn't known she'd been searching for. Everything had changed in the last few weeks. She had faced fear, uncertainty, and doubt. But she had also discovered strength, resilience, and an unbreakable bond with the small puppy who had stolen her heart. The drive home felt like it passed in a blur. Emily sat in the back seat, holding Whistle close, his tiny body warm and comforting against her. The streets, the houses, the trees, they all seemed new somehow, different than they had been before. The world outside the car window felt like a reflection of the new chapter they were about to begin. When they pulled into the driveway, Emily's heart raced. She could already imagine Whistle running around the yard, exploring the new world that was now his. He had been through so much, but now, he was finally going to have a life full of love and care. A life he deserved. She carried him inside, her mom following closely behind. The house felt different now, filled with a warmth and excitement that hadn't been there before. Emily placed Whistle on the floor, watching as he hesitated for a moment, then tentatively took his first steps into his new home. His movements were still a little unsteady, but there was something about the way he looked around the room that made Emily's heart swell with pride. He was curious, eager, and full of life, just as she had always known he could be. Over the next few days, Emily settled into a new routine. She kept Whistle close, ensuring he had everything he needed, from his cozy bed to his favorite squeaky toys. She continued to monitor his health, making sure he didn't overexert himself, but it was clear that he was adapting quickly. Every day, he grew stronger, more playful, and more at home. Whistle had already brought so much light into her life, but Emily knew that this was only the beginning. They had a long road ahead of them, filled with new adventures and challenges, but she was ready. Together, they had faced the impossible and come out the other side, stronger than ever. As she sat on the couch, watching Whistle play with his favorite toy, Emily smiled to herself. It had been a journey she would never forget, one that had changed her forever. And as she looked at Whistle, his tail wagging happily, she knew that no matter what happened, they would always have each other. The world was wide, and their story was just beginning.